This is Chad Miles. I'm co-host of the Bruce Collins Show, and an article caught my attention on the web yesterday about Nancy Pelosi, and the title of the article was Nancy Pelosi Can't Be Beaten. Basically what's going on is she's been acting very strange lately after the election of President Trump and then some subsequent special elections that the Democrats have lost, all four of them. There's been some questioning of her leadership because she's the House Minority Leader in the House of Representatives. And basically this article says, don't even waste your time. She's not going anywhere. She can't be beaten. And that's true. And what I wanted to share with you today is some of my political experience. And I've gone up against a member of the House of Representatives who's been there since the 1960s, and that was John Conyers. I ran for Congress against him in 2006. I lost big time, but it was an interesting experience, and I just want to share some of that with you, which kind of relates to this idea of Nancy Pelosi. And the idea is that once somebody is that entrenched in politics, once somebody has been there that long, the only way they're going to leave is if they die or they resign. I mean, that's basically it. They're not going anywhere. And John Conyers was no exception. He's still in office to this day, by the way. But so I just wanted to share some of my experience with you, and then also my political experience, but then my experience with the news media, because that was very interesting too. And I entitled this video "Fake News," and I don't know if it's so much fake news, but it's definitely a bias. And the way I was treated was a little bit flaky by the news media. But at any rate, let me just talk about the news media. I'll just go right into that. I did quite a few phone interviews with newspapers and with magazines, and I did a couple of different television interviews. Now, the way this would usually go is I would receive a phone call from a reporter, somebody from the news media, and they would want to talk to me. And it was always kind of a joke, like, oh, haha, you're running against John Conyers. How does it feel to be the sacrificial lamb? Blah, blah, blah. Why are you even wasting your time? That was basically the undertone, and I get that. I understand that. But I mean, come on. Somebody has to run against these people, and quite frankly, John Conyers has run unopposed quite a few times, which I think is ridiculous. But at any rate, so it was kind of a joke to them. So the interviews were never really serious. But it was really the one interview that really stands out was the interview I did for WXYZ TV Channel 7 in Detroit. And if you go to my YouTube channel page, look for that interview. It's posted up on there. You'll kind of see what I'm talking about in that interview. But basically, the way that went was I received a phone call or an email, I can't remember which, from WXYZ, and they requested for me to do an interview. So I drove up to their studio, which was actually in Southfield. It's not in Detroit, in the city of Detroit. And I got to their studio, and they took me into this room, and it was a conference room with this big, long conference table. And the reporter, Val Clark, sat all the way on the other side, and I sat on the far side. And they turned all the lights out in the room, and they had one harsh spotlight that was shining on me. I mean, it felt really like an interrogation, is what it really felt like. It was kind of interesting. And so we went through the interview, and they were asking me questions. And at the end, here's kind of the sneaky part. At what I thought was the end of the interview, they turned the spotlight off, and the camera guy acted like he was tearing down the equipment, basically. But the Val Clark, or the reporter, she kept asking me questions, and I thought, this is kind of squirrely. And it was squirrely because it turns out they weren't tearing down the equipment. The interview was not over. They kept recording, and they were trying to get me to talk about John Conyers, and they were trying to get me to say something bad about John Conyers, something negative. And we ended up talking about the impeachment of President George W. Bush, which was a hot topic at the time. But the way they did that, they tried to bait me into that, and I didn't fall for it, thankfully. But it was just really sneaky how they did that. But if you watch the interview, look at the way I look in the interview and contrast that with the way John Conyers looks, because he's lit evenly. He has a nice green plant behind him. For me, it was the opposite. I was harshly lit, and I was against a bare wall, basically. The way they introduced me was a little ridiculous, but you'll see what I'm talking about. But it's just a bunch of little subtle things that they did like that were really sneaky. The Comcast interview, that's also on the YouTube channel. That was very fair, and that was a very good interview, I thought. But it was a little underhanded, some of the things that they did. Now, this was back in 2006 when I ran, and I talked about the news media who didn't treat me seriously. And it's funny because the Republican Party in general didn't treat me very seriously either. And I'm not talking about the people who helped me, the people who were working on my campaign. They were excited about it. They thought it was great that somebody was running against John Conyers at the time, and they were very helpful. I'm talking about elected officials, people who were higher up on the totem pole, so to speak, in the Michigan Republican Party. I was in Michigan at the time. And it was just, when I would meet Republican Party officials, it was the not taking me seriously, oh, you're a glutton for punishment, aren't you? Ha ha ha, that sort of thing. Just completely blowing me off, basically. I'd meet them and they'd be like, ha ha, whatever, and they would turn their back on me and walk away, was essentially what happened. But there were two notable exceptions to this. And one was Representative Thaddeus McCotter, who was, I think, in the 8th District at the time in Michigan. He was very helpful, very nice guy. He gave me some very sound advice, which I really appreciated. And he was a really, really nice, took me as seriously as you could in that position. And again, I understand this was a long shot race, but you never know what's going to happen, And another person was actually the chairman of the Michigan Republican Party at the time, which was Saul Anuzis. And he was very helpful. I ran into him quite a few times because he was trying to help the gubernatorial candidate at the time, which was Dick DeVos. And so I ran into him quite a bit. He was crisscrossing the state, and every time I saw him, he would give me a different piece of advice, but it was constructive advice. So I always appreciated that from him. But getting back to this idea of people who are in office, especially in the House of Representatives for a long time, I often said, after I ran against John Conyers, I said, look, this guy could murder somebody on live television and be reelected from his jail cell before he was acquitted. And that's not too far from the truth. And what I was talking about was how entrenched these people are. And something interesting happened that kind of vindicated what I've been saying. I think it was in 2014, I believe. I'll have to look. I'll put a link to this article. But basically, what happens is when you run for the House of Representatives, you have to go out, in Michigan at least, I assume it's this way in other states, but you have to go out and you have to get signatures of people, of registered voters who want to see your name on the ballot. Basically, they're just giving their consent to saying, yes, we want to see you run for office. And you have to get 1,000 signatures. Now, that sounds a lot easier than it is, but somebody who has to go out like me, and I had to get a lot of those signatures by myself. I had a little bit of help, but I had to get a lot of those signatures by myself. It's kind of hard, and especially you run into people who hate politics. They don't want to, and especially if you're a Republican, which I was at the time. I mean, they really gave me a hard time, and all they wanted to do was complain about George Bush and attack me about George Bush, and it was the craziest thing. And it was crazy because every elected person in where I was from, up to the governor, was a Democrat. and George Bush was the president. But they would skip all those Democrats and complain about George Bush, who was the president. It was the craziest thing. So you have to get 1,000 signatures, and normally you would get more than that, just in case somebody would try to contest your signatures, that they weren't valid, and they would go through them with a fine-tooth comb. So I ended up turning in around 1,300 signatures. Typically, you would turn in 2,000, which is double the amount. Which is, in 2014, that's what John Conyers did. He turned in 2,000 signatures. Now, people went out and collected them for him because he was an elected official. But the funny thing is, he was being challenged in the primary at the time, and his primary challenger challenged his petition signatures. So they went through them with a fine-tooth comb, and guess what? Most of them weren't valid, and they threw all but little over 500 signatures. They threw out because they weren't valid. So now he's under the threshold of 1,000. He's not eligible to be on the ballot. This is an elected member of the House of Representatives, not eligible to be on the ballot. So you would think, oh, wow, well, I guess that's it, right? Maybe he can do a write-in campaign. No, guess what? A judge said, oh, you know what? He would have gotten on the ballot anyway, and they put him on the ballot, even though he had less than the required threshold of signatures. So, you see, people, I hate to sound like Trump, but it's rigged. It's rigged. And if you're entrenched, you're going to be there. You're going to be there till you die, or you're going to be there until you resign. I mean, that's just the bottom line. What's the solution? Well, if people maybe would take candidates like I was back then a little more serious, that might help. Term limits, some people say term limits. I'm not too crazy about term limits on the federal level. The office of the president has term limits, but I think that's a very unique office, and I think that the power that we've ceded to that branch warrants term limits. I think the term limits are a good idea in that aspect. But I don't know about the House of Representatives. I mean, they're up for a re-election every 2 years, so that was supposed to be, they were supposed to be more accountable than they are now, but things have gotten really skewed. But that's my experience, a little bit of my experience. That's not everything, but that's a little bit of my experience in politics, with the news media, as far as fake news, biased news. I mean, the news media was certainly biased against me, no question about it. But that was just my experience. If you have a comment about your experience or a question, leave it in the comments below. If you like it, give it a like. If you don't like it, give it a thumbs down. I don't care, whatever. If you like the content, subscribe. And that's all I have. So thanks for watching.